Welcome back. Today we will be focusing on the Inferno as a whole and the part it plays in the comedy, its key themes and structure, and how it relates to the other canticles. But before we get into it, it will be helpful to unpack a bit of Dante's cosmology. In order to understand the Inferno, we have to understand where hell fits into the structure of the created universe. And to understand that, we have to have a firm picture in our minds of the medieval cosmos. Going back all the way to Aristotle and before, men based their understanding of the universe on what they could see with the naked eye. And when you go out on a clear night, what do you see? You see the moon and the planets and the stars wheeling above you from east to west. Even during the day, you see the sun, as David says in Psalm 19, as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, rejoicing as a strong man ready to run a race. His going forth is from the end of the heaven, and his circuit unto the ends of it. It was a natural assumption, therefore, to believe Earth was stationary, with the heavens in orbit around it. It might sound like being at the center of the universe was something the ancients and medievals would take pride in, but they didn't. They looked up into the heavens and saw life and dance and music up there, a joy and vitality from which they, stuck on the earth, were excluded. For Earth is under the curse and dominated by sin, which can be traced back even before Adam and Eve to the fall of Satan. According to Dante's understanding of creation, when the world was made, God placed dry land in every region of the globe. When Satan fell from heaven, he fell headfirst into the southern hemisphere, at the exact opposite spot on the globe from what later would be Jerusalem. The land that was there in the southern hemisphere, fearing this fallen angel, quote, made a veil of the sea, Dante says. It fled down through the middle of the earth and pushed its way up into the land under what would become the Middle East. Falling all the way through to the very center of the earth, Satan became imprisoned there, unable to move. More earth surrounding Satan's legs also fled, but that bit of land fled upwards, out of the water and into the air of the southern hemisphere, marking the place where Satan entered. This second displacement of land, as we will discover in the second canticle, is what forms Mount Purgatory. The cavern of hell itself, opening up above Satan's head toward the Mediterranean Sea, was carved out by the four rivers of the underworld, Acheron, Styx, Phlegethon, and Cocytus. As we will see in the following lectures, they were not so much rivers as stagnant pools, the lowest one being entirely frozen over. These four rivers are a twisted parody of the four rivers flowing out of Eden mentioned in Genesis 2, leading not to riches and life, but to misery and death. They carve a funnel-shaped cavern, broad at the top and growing narrower as the closer it gets to the middle. So, taking a step back, we see Satan trapped in ice at the center of the entire universe. Above him, going up toward the northern hemisphere, a vast cavern gradually opens wider and wider, forming 9 distinct circles with a 10th antechamber at the very top. Going the other way, down Satan's legs and up through to the surface of the earth on the southern hemisphere, at that place exactly opposite from Jerusalem, we find Mount Purgatory rising from the sea. Similar to the cavern of hell, the side of the mountain is divided into 9 distinct sections, and the very top of the mountain forms a 10th space. Rising upward from the top of Mount Purgatory and out of Earth's atmosphere, the medieval cosmological model divided the heavens into 9 concentric spheres like nesting dolls. The first 7 spheres were the home to the 7 planets, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The 8th sphere housed the fixed stars, while the 9th was the prima mobile, or the first moved. This outer sphere formed the boundary of the material universe. Beyond it was a 10th realm called the Empyrean, which was not so much the place where God was, but rather the very presence of God himself. According to the model, God as prime mover moved the 9th sphere by his love. As that 9th sphere moved with love, it moved the 8th in love, the 8th the 7th, and so on down to the orbit of the moon. This is why the medievals did not take great pride in being at the center of the universe like we might think. The earth was at the polar opposite end of the universe from God, from the source of all light and joy and love. Satan, encased in ice at the center of the earth, was the perfect image of what earth itself was: cursed, corrupted by sin and death, enslaved by its base passions, excluded from the great dance of the heavens above. The comedy is the story of a pilgrim on a long pilgrimage, wandering the different landscapes of the afterlife. But he is not wandering aimlessly. As with all pilgrimages, there is a specific destination, a specific goal. But being alive and having never journeyed through hell, purgatory, or paradise, he needs a guide. We'll consider this more in the following lecture, but after Dante fails to make it past the three beasts on the mountain, a shade appears in the distance. It is the shade of Virgil, author of the great Roman epic, the Aeneid. As the supreme poet of the Roman Empire, Virgil represents the highest authority in the limited temporal realm. He also represents the kind of knowledge and reason man has by common grace, apart from divine revelation. This gives Virgil an authority the pilgrim, at this stage of his journey, can easily recognize and submit to. But more than that, Dante is suggesting that at this early stage, what the soul lost in a wood needs is not a lecture, not some moralistic exhortation, but the beauty of poetry. His soul has been entranced with the things of this world. He needs to be captivated by a beauty bolder and more intense than anything the world can offer. Poetry stands for such beauty, and Virgil stands for such poetry. Actually, Virgil only represents the making of such beauty. The true beauty that will finally heal the pilgrim is not something Virgil can offer. As we will see, Virgil can only bring Dante part of the way. Virgil's main role in the first two canticles is to explain what Dante is seeing and to correct any mistaken ideas he might have. However, we have to always remember that Virgil is himself one of the damned, someone Virgil himself describes as having lost the good of the intellect. We'll unpack more of what that means in the following lecture, but for now it is enough to say that we have to take everything Virgil says with a grain of salt. He knows 2 and 2 is 4, but he does not have a complete or perfect understanding about everything. His knowledge is limited and sometimes mistaken. He often gives voice to the teaching of Aristotle, and while Aristotle saw certain things very clearly, his overall way of seeing the world sometimes led him into deep error. Virgil is slightly different because he now knows he was wrong, being in hell, but even so, he does not clearly see the whole truth. And we'll discuss these errors when we come across them. Broadly speaking, the Inferno is a Christian explanation of sin using an Aristotelian paradigm of vice. Why does Dante do this? As Paul says in Romans 2, the pagans did not have the 10 Commandments given on Mount Sinai, but they did have the law written on their hearts. This law was sufficient to guide them toward some form of righteousness or accuse them of their disobedience. Dante, as did Aquinas before him, saw this principle at work in the ethics of Aristotle. Therefore, in order to understand how the Inferno presents sin and what it does to the human soul, we have to talk about the Aristotelian understanding of the appetites. Now, this might sound like a bit of confusing and unimportant philosophy, but I assure you it is at the core of how all three parts of the comedy are structured, and therefore important for us to understand. If the comedy were a building, this is the framing behind the walls, giving it shape, holding it all together. According to Aristotle, as well as medieval scholastic thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, everything we do, every choice we make, comes from a certain appetite of the soul. An appetite is simply the desire for something, and there are three basic categories of objects that we want, things like physical pleasure, food, money, or the things money can buy. These are called simple goods. They give us pleasure in themselves, and we want them for their own sake. Then there are goods that are not pleasant in themselves, but are necessary in order to get the simple goods that we do want. These are called arduous goods, and are things like work. For example, if I want ice cream, a simple good, I either have to make it myself or earn money somehow to buy it. Both the process of making the ice cream and the work I would do to earn money are arduous goods. I want to work not for its own sake, but for the simple goods my working will provide. The third category of objects that our soul desires are not material in nature like ice cream or the work done to obtain it. Instead, they are rational goods, goods we do not perceive with our senses, but rather understand with our minds. It is this third appetite that longs for justice, truth, goodness, and beauty. These ideas are very real, but by themselves have no material existence in this world. I can't walk over to a justice tree and pluck off a bit of justice fruit, right? No, these are ideas we have to think about, ideas that give us a framework to understand the world that we live in. These three appetites have complicated philosophical names like concupiscible, irascible, and intellectual. The concupiscible appetite is the desire for simple goods, the irascible is the desire for arduous goods, and the intellectual appetite is the desire for rational goods. Now, what does any of this have to do with Dante? Aristotle, whom Dante is following here, taught that when these appetites were corrupted, they lead to three different categories of vice. When the desire for simple goods is not controlled by reason, it leads to a lack of self-restraint. We overindulge ourselves and lose all sense of moderation. I don't know if you have ever eaten too much ice cream, but I have. And when I can't stop eating, even though I know I should, my appetite for something that is good in itself, the ice cream, is literally out of control. This is a corruption of the concupiscible appetite, leading to a lack of self-moderation or self-restraint, what Aristotle calls incontinence. When the desire for arduous goods is not controlled by reason, it leads to violence. And if that connection seems a bit obscure, let me ask you this. Do you ever get frustrated working on a project when things are not going according to plan? You're trying to make something and it's just not working the way you want it to, and so you start to grit your teeth or clench your fists, or you feel like you just want to hit something or blurt out words that might make your grandmother blush. Well, that frustration is a mild form of violence. If totally uncontrolled by reason, that impulse would lead to things like murder, theft, or even cursing God's name in rage. This is what happens when the irascible appetite goes bad. Finally, when the desire for intellectual goods is twisted and bent by a wicked love of self, it leads to fraud. Fraud, in this sense, is the word used to describe the use of the intellect to cheat, deceive, extort, or betray other people. In short, fraud is using other people for your own selfish purposes while appearing to be thinking about them. The ultimate example of this kind of fraud, which we will see in the final canto of Inferno, is Judas betraying Jesus with a kiss. Outwardly, he is showing Jesus affection, but that kiss is a lie. It was not real affection at all, but rather betrayal, as the kiss was the sign to the Roman guards telling them which man to arrest. This is fraud. And that is what happens when the intellectual appetite is unrestrained by any sense of true justice or righteousness. For Dante, these different appetites of the soul were created by God. They are a way of describing how the soul relates to the world and to the different kinds of objects in the world. A right use of the appetites submitted to the lordship of Jesus would keep the soul properly ordered. A rightly ordered concupiscible appetite would lead us to love the things God loves, to desire the simple goods of creation that He made for us to enjoy. A rightly ordered irascible appetite would lead us to embrace the trials and the hardships of this life, knowing that suffering produces character and character hope. And a rightly ordered intellectual appetite would lead us to recognize and desire true, God-honoring justice in everything that we do. Furthermore, a rightly ordered intellectual appetite would be capable of governing the other two, helping moderate our desire for simple goods and remind us of the true purpose of difficult situations. So again, what does all of this have to do with Dante's Inferno? The three appetites and their corruptions define the structure of hell. How does this work? Every sin is a transgression of the law of God, and in this sense, all sins are equal. As James says, if you have broken one part of the law, you have broken the whole law. From white lies to the deadly betrayal of a friend, all sins equally deserve eternal judgment and separation from God. However, if we think about where that sin is coming from and what it is doing to the soul, we can discern some differences. Even though Aristotle didn't have a Christian concept of sin, Dante still used his three categories of vice, based on the three appetites of the soul, to construct this eternal realm of punishment and wrath. Dante's hell is divided into upper, middle, and lower regions, following these three categories of sin and vice. The upper section holds those who sinned by means of the concupiscible appetite. The middle holds those who sinned by means of the irascible appetite, while lower hell, you guessed it, contains those who sinned by means of the intellectual appetite. We'll come back to what is happening in the first circle in a moment, but in circles 2, 3, and 4, we meet the lustful, the gluttons, and the avaricious, respectively. These were sinners whose sins were defined by an excessive passion for simple goods, sex, food, and wealth. In the words of Romans 16:18, they served not our Lord Jesus Christ, but their own belly, or where Paul in Philippians 3:19 describes the enemies of Christ as those whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame. Sex and food and wealth are all good things in themselves, simple goods desired by the concupiscible appetite, but the souls in these circles allowed their desire for these goods to rule them. For Dante, the sin punished here were not calculated decisions, but rather the result of unrestrained passion. These sinners failed to use the reason God gave them to control their instincts and desires. In this way, the lustful, the gluttons, and the avaricious are more akin to beasts than anything truly human. They abandoned reason and let their belly be their god. By contrast, circles 8 and 9 down at the bottom of hell contain the fraudulent, whose sins were wholly intellectual in nature, without a trace of passion or lust. The object of their sin was not something good in itself, like food, but the very tang of injustice. The fraudulent wanted to hurt others. They wanted to be cruel. They wanted to build themselves up at the expense of their fellow image bearers. They were not simply enjoying God's creation too much. They maliciously twisted and exploited others for their own gain. In between these two poles are the heresiarchs in circle 6 and the violent in circle 7. The sin committed by these souls comes from a mixture of passion and intellect. Violence is certainly passionate, but it is also calculating. In this sense, it is different from the pure passion of wrath, which we will talk about in a minute, and fraud, which is purely intellectual. These are the sins of the irascible appetite, whereas the sins of passion and desire and the sins of the intellect are perhaps easier for us to understand. The sins of the irascible appetite take a little bit more explanation, especially as it relates to both the violent and the founders of heretical sects. When the irascible appetite is engaged, we are desiring something for the sake of something else, hard work for the sake of its reward. Rightly ordered, it is the willingness to embrace difficulty with patience, knowing that fruit will come of it. Taken to its righteous extreme, it is the appetite that willingly embraces martyrdom for the sake of obtaining the heavenly crown. We will talk about this more when we get there, but this is why the martyrs in Paradiso are one of the 3 groups of saints who exemplify the irascible appetite in its perfected form. So what does this have to do with the sinners here in hell? The sinners in circles 6 and 7 stand as examples of the 2 ways this appetite can be corrupted. The violent cannot patiently endure the suffering and so turn to violence to demand the good they are seeking. The heresiarchs, on the other hand, are willing to die. They are willing to lay down their lives like martyrs. In fact, they are even called martyrs in Canto 10. The difference is their martyrdom was based on a lie. They laid down their lives for doctrines that were false, lies that did violence to their own souls and the souls of the many who followed in their footsteps. Circle 7, where the violent are punished, is divided into 3 wheels based on the 3 different objects of violence: others, self, and God. But violence can be done both to a person and to that person's property. And so, in the first wheel, both tyrants and robbers are punished, those who were violent against other people and against other people's property. In the second wheel, both suicides and squanderers are punished, those who were violent against their own person and those who were violent against their own property. In the third wheel, blasphemers, sodomites, and usurers are punished, those who were violent against God directly, against nature, that is God's property, and against the productivity of man, which Dante calls God's grandchild, being the offspring of God's children. These are the usurers who extort or do violence to the wealth of others by means of steep rates of interest. We will discuss these differences more when we see them in the text, but for now I want to simply give you an overview of the different circles. If you have been paying attention, however, you will notice that I passed over circle 5, where the wrathful and sullen are. There are several geographical boundary markers in hell: the Acheron, the Styx, the gates of Dis, and so on. While they typically separate different regions, the wrathful and the sullen are actually punished in the river Styx, just before the gates of Dis. This is interesting, as wrath and sullenness provide something of a bridge between the sins of upper and middle hell, between the sins of passion and of violence. On the one hand, the sinners here in the fifth circle, like those in circles 2 through 4, are governed by their passions. As we will see when you read through the text, the wrathful simply bite and gnaw each other to pieces. They have almost become pure animals. There is no humanity left. As for the sullen, they have given themselves over to apathy, disdain, and discontentment, such that they cannot even lift themselves above the surface of the river to interact with the pilgrim. Both categories of sinners have lost control of their passions, which places them in upper hell, but at the same time their sins were violent in nature, either physically or spiritually. I point this out because it shows how the various circles form something of a sliding scale. The wrathful and sullen represent a transitional kind of sin, as do the usurers who sit at the very edge of the third wheel of the seventh circle, overlooking a great cliff that drops down to the eighth circle. Pure passion is not violent, but if left alone, it will eventually grow violent. So too, usury is not technically fraud, but as the interest rates are openly declared, but there it is on the edge. With this geographical arrangement, the poet Dante is demonstrating that certain sins lead to other sins. He has his fixed regions in order to explore the nature of lust, violence, and fraud, with sinners eternally suffering in each of these circles. But he does not want to give the idea that sin is therefore necessarily static. No, lust can very easily lead to violence, just as violence can very easily lead to fraud. This is the principle revealed in these transitional circles. And what about the first circle, the place Dante calls limbo? Here we find the so-called virtuous pagans. Virgil says they are here in hell not because of any specific sin committed, but rather because they did not believe in Jesus. Like we saw earlier, Virgil himself is someone who has lost the good of the intellect, and therefore we cannot take his explanations as gospel truth. In Purgatorio, he admits that his vision only goes so far since he is unregenerate and does not have faith, which fully opens the eyes to reality. As I have already mentioned, his knowledge is limited to what fallen reason supported by common grace can perceive. This means that he can see and know a great deal, but his knowledge remains imperfect. Thus, when Virgil says the inhabitants of the first circle, like himself, are without sin, he is speaking from the standpoint of Aristotelian ethics and not from a Christian understanding of sin. The pagans in the first circle attained temporal happiness, guided by philosophy and the golden mean, the virtue that exists between an excess and a deficiency, both of which would be a vice. For instance, the virtue of courage is a character trait that exists between the vices of recklessness, the result of an excess, and cowardice, the result of deficiency. This is what Virgil means by saying the souls in the first circle did not sin. But in this we see the first cracks in Virgil's reliability. What Virgil does not know and cannot understand is Romans 14:23, where Paul says, "Whatsoever is not of faith is sin." Therefore, even the virtuous pagans, virtuous according to Greek philosophy, are sinners according to the Word of God, for they did not have faith, nor was their virtue grounded in faith. This is why they are in hell. At the same time, their relative virtue helps distinguish the gradations of sin and sin's effect on both the human soul and human community. The decent, virtuous, and unbelieving neighbor who doesn't steal your mail and mows your lawn when your family is on vacation would be a genuinely better neighbor than someone like Genghis Khan. It is this difference that is being represented in Inferno. And finally, what is going on in the antechamber, the outer ring within the gates of hell, but outside of the Acheron? This is where the neutrals are punished, those who neither sinned grievously nor pursued virtue in any way. They lived quiet, cowardly, and insignificant lives, neither in obedience to Christ nor to any great idea of nobility or virtue. Virgil says this about them. He says, "They mix with that base course of angels that rebelled not nor were faithful to God, but only always acted for themselves. Banned from heaven, lest they mar its beauty, hell will not receive them, lest the guilty find some reason to glory over them." We'll consider these souls again in the following lecture, but for now, they complete the 9+1 structure of hell, the same structure that governs the other two realms. In this way, the sliding scale of sin is complete. Souls who lived neither in infamy nor praise, to the unbelieving pagans, to those who lacked self-restraint, to the violent, and on to the fraudulent. So, according to Dante, what does sin do to human nature? There are many places in the Inferno where Virgil tells the pilgrim that some sins are more hateful to God than others, those more hateful being punished further down. Placing sins on a scale like this does not mean that they are less worthy of punishment or less worthy of damnation. No, everyone, including the so-called virtuous pagans in the first circle, have equally lost the good of the intellect and are equally separated from God by their choices. When Dante introduces this idea of some sins being more hateful than others, he is drawing attention to what these specific sins do to human nature. Some sins come from an excessive love of the good things. These are the sins of incontinence or a lack of self-control. Again, sex, food, wealth are good things in themselves, created and given by God. But when we love them so much that we turn them into idols, making gods of our bellies, then that excessive love makes us enemies of Christ, as we read in Philippians 3. However, they were not wrong to love these objects. In fact, there is something natural about that love. What places them in hell is the excessive nature of their love, and it is this excess that makes them less like humans and more like animals. Some sins come from a defective love of good things. These are the sins of violence. The sinners in this middle realm hated the way God ordered creation. Their inability to patiently endure whatever circumstance they were in led to taking things into their own hands, either by murder or theft or a rejection of nature itself, as with the sodomites or suicides. Here, though their passion and frustration cause them to lose control to some degree, there is an element of rationality. They are not simply given over to their lusts. They are consciously choosing to disregard the way God made the world. Finally, some sins come from a misdirected love. These are the sins of fraud. While the first two categories of sinners still, in some way, loved something outside of themselves, whether that be the simple goods of food and the like, or the objects that led to murder and theft, this last category of sinners love only self. Their love is not focused on things good in themselves, simply in the wrong way. Their love is focused on the wrong object altogether. Their love of self led to cold and calculated actions designed specifically to glorify self at the expense of others. Let me put this another way. It is possible to love sex, food, wealth, and other simple goods in the right way and to the right degree. This happens when a love for those things are secondary, with love for God, love for the supreme good, governing every other love. But apart from the atoning work of Christ on the cross and the work of the Spirit to make us alive in Him, we are dead in our trespasses and sins. And this means in our natural fallen state, we are missing that all-governing love for God. In its absence, a love for simple goods rises to the top and takes control. This leads, as we have seen, either to a lust that obtains those goods or to violence when there are obstacles that must be overcome. In other words, without a love for God that controls us, our sinful loves will either be excessive or defective. But the fact that these sinners are still looking outward toward goods outside of themselves means they are not twisting human nature in the same way or to the same degree as those who sin by means of the intellectual appetite. This last category of sin, that which comes from a misdirected love, is most hateful to God in Dante's theology, and therefore occupy the lowest circles of hell, because they have twisted, bent, and misused the faculty of reason, which is that element of our soul that most closely connects us with God. The first two appetites, the concupiscible and the irascible, are appetites shared with the beasts. Man alone, apart from the angels, have been given an appetite for rational objects. In all creation, we alone have a mind that is capable of thought and reason and intelligent speech. When this unique and special faculty is twisted away from God and others and placed in service of self, in service of sinful, selfish ends, then we are corrupting that faculty which, more than anything else, identifies us as having been made in the image of God. And this is why these kinds of sins are more hateful. Now, it needs to be said that in reality, in this life, every sinner sins with all three appetites all the time. Sin is not so tidily organized as it appears to be in Dante's representation of hell. This is why we have to remember that this journey is an allegory and not meant to be taken purely on the literal level. Dante's main desire in Inferno is to isolate and describe certain kinds of sins, what those sins are and what they do both to the human soul and to human communities. His purpose is not to say that sin can be so easily categorized in real life. In fact, as he makes clear in several places, the sinners could have been placed in multiple circles, having sinned in many different ways. Instead, Dante is using certain historical or mythological characters to demonstrate how different sins corrupt the nature of man in specific ways, whether it be his passions or his intellect, or a combination of the two. Finally, we need to briefly address Dante's approach to the punishments we will see in hell. The last word of Canto 28 of Inferno is one of Dante's own making, contrapasso. Literally it means counter, contra, step, passo, but it is closely tied to the Latin contrapassum, which means retaliation. Though only appearing once in the whole comedy, it is the idea that defines all the punishments in hell. It is the punishment that fits the crime. The contrapasso reveals the corresponding eternal consequences of actions taken in this life. More than that, it is the unveiling or revealing of a person's sin in its true nature. This looks like schismatics being ripped apart, hypocrites walking slowly adorned with gilded lead cloaks, the lustful being blown about by a fierce wind, fortune-tellers walking with their heads twisted behind them. The sin for which the damned are being punished now defines their pain, either as an expression of the sin itself or as an expression of the direct consequence of the sinful action. Whatever form the contrapasso takes, defining the punishment the damned must suffer, the sinners are wholly given over in death to what they grasped after in life. I want to finish this first lecture on Inferno by reading a portion from Romans 1, as it really helps set the stage for what Dante is doing in this first canticle. This is Romans 1, 18 through 32, reading from the English Standard Version. Paul says this, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies amongst themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty of their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They were full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They were gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but they give approval to those who practice them." 3 times Paul says God gave them up. He gave them up to their lusts, to their dishonorable passions, and to their debased minds. That is the nature of hell when God says to man, "Here you go, have it your way." As we will see in the following lecture, coming to the shores of the Acheron, Dante watches as the damned scramble across and run toward their punishment. Virgil says this about them: "They are eager to pass over the stream, because divine justice so spurs them on that fear has turned itself into desire." In other words, the damned are where they want to be. This is their home, eternally separated from the God that they hate. They are living out the consequences of their choices, consequences that they embrace and even desire. It'll be hard to witness. While Dante remains extremely precise in his images and does not stray into gratuitous violence or horror for its own sake, the images of the damned in hell can still be hard to walk through. Like the pilgrim, we will be tempted by pity and compassion, but the lesson the pilgrim learns is that these torments are not only the just punishments of a just God, they are in fact chosen and embraced by the sinners. They would rather endure all the suffering than bow the knee to Christ. That was their posture in life, and it will be their posture for eternity. This is what the poem means on the literal level. On the allegorical level, it is a horrifying and yet very convicting picture of what my own sin is doing to my soul. This is what the poet Dante wants me to see as I read through Inferno. Not first and foremost how bad all these other people must have been, but how bad I must be, having given myself to the same sorts of sins, even if only in my own heart. Finally, remember that the Inferno is only part one. It is the darkest and most terrible of the three because it is the furthest removed from mercy, grace, and the light of Christ. But we will make it through to the other side, I promise. We will once again rise to see the stars.